start with Hortense Tate, who I think you're 100 years old now, is that right?
Don't tell it.
Don't tell me.
Yes, I am.
And you came to Montclair about 1921, was it?
1921.
And as some of you know, this building, this house, served for a number of years as the headquarters for the YWCA. So Mrs. Tate is very familiar with this house.
I've lived in this building.
Well, you live in this building,
Well,
right, okay. I mean in recent years, since they made it into a museum.
We used to go there for dances on Friday nights with all my friends. We had a good time.
I attended the day camp before school. I was like 4 years old. I even saw some pictures, some old pictures of me with some high-top shoes on at the Y.
Mrs. Tate encouraged all of us to go to college. She taught us how to be ladies.
I went there frequently to teas given on a Sunday afternoon.
I'm sure the YWCA was our salvation. We lived in Lynchburg. My mother lived in Lynchburg, and my father, to whom she was married, was still practicing law in Danville. And she didn't want to live in Danville, and he didn't want to move his practice to Lynchburg. And he had a very good friend from Danville who lived in New Jersey, in Newark, had a funeral business, still does. And so he decided to move to Montclair. And that was in 1920, in August 1920.
Work. That's what brought all of them up here, was work. Well, all they could do down south was work in the fields. So they came up to Montclair and work. I think she came up when she was about 16 years old, by herself. Most of the people came by themselves. But she had to stay with someone. My mother did. So she stayed with Charles Morton and Elizabeth Morton. Because her mother wouldn't let her come up here unless she stayed with someone.
I married the guy from Montclair. He came to Howard, and we met at Howard. Well, there was no question he was coming back to Montclair.
My mother was born and raised in Montclair. My father was from Florida and left Florida as a young man and came to New Jersey, and that's where he met my mother.
Newark, it was noisy, and I had little playmates, Fifi and Pinky, and I could run out on the street and we could run up and down the streets, and there were lots of people. And then when we moved to Montclair, we were in a house that was set back from the road, and it had wild woods all around us. We were in the country. We could hear crickets, and I was afraid of insects, and there were no people around, not like Newark.
My husband was working for RCA, and it was able to travel from here. So that was how we got here. And he was walking up and down the street, and he found these little houses for sale, and it seemed like it would fit our lifestyle, so we were so excited. We were the first in our family to own a house.
Growing up in Montclair, there was only two reasons for living in Montclair. That was because some cousin or aunt or someone had told you to come north because there were good jobs here, and they meant domestic jobs. And other people came because the schools were better for their children, and they weren't segregated, and they didn't want their children raised in a segregated place.
What's generally considered the Great Migration, 1915 to about 1940, over 1 million African Americans left the South to find jobs and homes and opportunity in the North. Certain impulses or pushes from the South, as people say, and pulls from the North that brought people forward. Racial discrimination, economic discrimination in the South, political unrest, and the North looked like the land of opportunity, the promised land.
We moved into not an exclusive white neighborhood. It was just a block in from Bloomfield Avenue, the main street. And the neighbor on one side was very unhappy that blacks were moving in. But the neighbor on the other side, it didn't seem to matter. At least they spoke. But Mrs. Sigler was her name. She never spoke, even though my mother spoke to her and insisted that we speak to her. And of course we said, but she never answers. And my mother said, I'm not raising Miss Sigler, I'm raising you. And finally, she came around and started to speak.
You see, when you look like you're white, you got your foot in the door before they know it. And once you're in there, what can they say? That's how she bought the house, because she went up there and they thought she was white, and then she showed up with all these colored children.
The Blockbusters came in. I guess maybe we had one African American family moving on the block. So they went up and down the block and said, don't you want to move? And some of the neighbors called me, and we went up and down the block and we said, don't you want to stay? Most of the people stayed. We had like one or two who felt they couldn't stay.
And of course, there was de facto segregation. You could not get a mortgage on a house except in certain areas. And of course, South End was one of the areas where you could get it.
So redlining occurred in the 20s when builders controlled the real estate market. It became encoded in federal law during the New Deal when the government began making Federal Housing Administration loans to people to build houses. So the gradation that the real estate market used in terms of the risk of a house ranged from A to D, green to red, color-coded. So there were maps that were actually developed that would show the color coding.
There was a minister at Union Baptist Church where we belonged, which was right around the corner from where we lived. And the minister there talked to them so much about buying a home, the importance of buying property, buying a home. So many of the people who actually worked in service were able to buy a home.
Some were in construction, some were doctors. My father was a butler. Some of the kids, their fathers were chauffeurs or cooks. So they were all classes. They were hairdressers. People owned their own beauty parlors, their own cleaners. I was thinking the other day we had black pharmacists on the corner of Elliman and Bloomfield Avenue.
And there was a black home loan and something. My father belonged to one. You could put money in that and save to get a down payment on the house, and maybe even through it get your mortgage. And it was black run by businessmen and doctors and lawyers and all. And that's how they were able to save money to buy these houses.
It was set up so that the blacks bought homes here, the kids went to Glenfield School, generally speaking. Dividing line was Lincoln Street. This side of Lincoln Street went to Nishoane. Across the street they went to Glenfield. So we had to have a house on this side of the street. He didn't want his youngsters to go to Glenfield, although he had gone to Glenfield.
Matter of fact, we went to school with white kids, mostly Italians, you know, because they lived down in that area. But soon as their parents was able to buy a house, they moved out of that area because black people was moving in. But down there at Glenfield School, when we were younger, they were friends. But when they got up Montclair High, it was a different story. So that's the way it was in those days.
I went to a school right on the borderline of Montclair, and it went to 9th grade. We didn't go to high school from that school until 10th grade. And they taught us how to make beds and how to cook and how to do all the things that you would do if you became a maid in some white person's house.
I didn't do well in high school because you weren't encouraged to, you weren't made to feel that you were capable of doing better. But when I went to Fisk, I was on the dean's list, and when I went to Montclair State, you know, I was very successful.
I'll say this, that if you were bad, bad to them meant dumb. So a lot of kids, not girls so much, but a lot of boys ended up in special ed. But they ended up in special ed because they couldn't control them. It wasn't because they weren't bright. It was just that they were bored with school, they didn't like school, so they disrupted. So rather than have you disrupt, they would say that you were special.
So while there was no segregation in terms of school buildings, there was certainly a differential and discriminatory treatment of students within the classroom. School districts actually allowed parents to do their own gerrymandering. So if you didn't like where your child was being sent to school, if you were a white parent, you didn't like where your child was being sent to school, your child could be moved out of the school and sent to another school. Black parents did not have that kind of leeway. So segregation in the schools was on the inside rather than on the outside.
Grandmother Allen became involved in anything that she didn't think was being done correctly so far as our people were concerned. And she was the one who got the first black policeman in Montclair. She was the one that integrated the line at commencement at the high school.
And the black students marched at the end of the line until 1930 when I graduated. And my mother had gone to the superintendent and the board and objected to that. So with the last name of Allen, I was number 2 or 3 in the line, and the line was completely integrated.
A lot of the guys that I went to high school with left school and were given their diplomas, you know, in their senior year anyway. And my yearbook reflects that, you know, the guys that had gone, especially the black guys. There weren't too many white guys that I recall, because a lot of the white guys went to college to avoid the war, you know. A lot of guys went, and I had 2 uncles that went. The man I married went, but he was stateside the whole war, and it's, you know, we did our part.
At that point, black doctors could not practice at the hospital. When their patients went in the hospital, they had to turn them over to a white doctor for service and practice and whatnot. Then when they were discharged, they could go back to their black doctors. So that was his number 1 priority at that point, to get on the staff, to desegregate the staff of the 3 hospitals we had then. And that happened gradually. Beginning as of 47, I think, was the first one.
They would get involved in protests when we finally got the courage to protest.
Grunning's ice cream parlor, and there was one right next to the Claridge Theater. I can't remember the name of that one, where you knew you didn't go in there, and that was okay. We went someplace else, you know. It was Whalen's Drugstore. We could always go in there and sit at the counter and have ice cream soda or what have you, you know.
You had your own stores. I mean, downtown here. I don't know whether my grandmother ever bored uptown too much, you know. And your grocery stores and your meat markets and everything.
I used to go to the theater in New York because I refused to be segregated. And I had not truthfully seen many good moving pictures before I came out here as a woman, a young woman, because I have always refused to be segregated. I think I've been in the Wellmont about 5 or 6 times only, because I still remember when they used to put you on one side and I refused to do it. And I would go into New York and go to the movies and then come back home. And because I felt that we had to prove that we don't take that. We are people. And that was the kind of thing that we tried to do. We are people who love our neighbors. We know how to act. We know what to do. And I tried to prove it.
Yeah, but I went to college in the 60s, and we protested everything. So, I mean, you know, that period is alive and well.
It's one reason it's better now.
That's correct. That's correct. That's correct. Absolutely. Thank you.
As more African Americans moved north, more racism and segregation reared its ugly head. As some said, Jim Crow actually got on the train, moved north, and settled in the suburbs.
The YWCA was our salvation, because there were so many activities in the town to which we could not belong that, you know, you could feel so slighted, and as a child wonder, well, who am I? What is there about me that I can't belong to the French club? I take French. What is there about me that I can't belong to the Glee Club? I have a good voice. So the YWCA and the YMCA for boys, you know, just saved us from being so bitter about things. And my mother, of course, wouldn't let us become bitter.
The African American women actually took it upon themselves to say, we need a place for the young women who are coming into town to work as domestic servants, where they can be cared for, a safe place, and they can get to know each other and actually grow and develop. And it was at that point, Alice Foster gathered women from the black churches in Montclair and said, let us do something, and actually established what became the YWCA.
The Y hadn't, I don't think, had been organized very long when we moved there. And of course, through our church, which was just around the corner, Union Baptist Church, she learned about the Y and went there and took us there.
And many of the women who ascribed to a politics of respectability said, yes, this is something we can do, and they did it from the churches. One might ask, why did they want a YWCA? Why not just take care of the women in their churches? Because there were many black churches in Montclair. One reason is that the church space was actually male space. The male pastors determined what happened, what did not happen. The YW would become women's space. She approached the white women in town for their assistance in getting this moving. Because of the racial and class hierarchy in the suburbs, black women recognized they needed to form allies with white women if they were going to get anything done. And in fact, the white women in town thought this was a marvelous idea, because for white women, the YW looked like a place to vet potential domestic workers. It was a place that they would learn how to serve and pour well. And it was also a place that they did not have to worry about how to house their domestic servants.
There were white women who contributed financially, and I guess, you know, they probably always thought we needed some kind of help. And there was a white board and a black board.
In the North, where there are YWCA branches established, as in the Oranges, right next door to Montclair, black YWCA, or colored branch as they called it, and a white central branch. And that kind of balancing works for the YWCA National Board. They said, yes, we look like an integrated organization if we have a white segregated branch and a black segregated branch, but they're all YWCAers.
The Black Ys came about through major philanthropic endeavors by very, very, very wealthy white people. They said, oh, okay, we're Christian association, but we still want separate but equal. So we'll build these Ys, and they did them all over the country.
WC was very unusual because it was not a branch. The YWCA was already organized by black women. This sort of tells you of the caliber of the women that were living in Montclair at the time. There's no white YWCA.
Clearly, the white women in Montclair did not want black women to begin to think of themselves as social equals. And if there were a white central YWCA, along with the already established now Glenridge Avenue YWCA, they would look as though they were equivalent, socially equivalent. And whenever these women would go to a YWCA conference, they would go as equals. And I can just imagine that that was anathema to these suburban white women.
We had a wonderful YWCA secretary, Alice Foster, and a girl reserve. That was what the girls were called, Girl Reserve Secretary, Hortense Ridley, and these two boards.
For the black women at the Glenridge Avenue YWCA, things could not have looked better. They decided what programs they were going to implement. They decided who they would hire, just getting the okay from the white board. They were no longer under the gaze of black men in the church who would tell them what they could do, what they could not do, nor the gaze of white women who also wanted to control black women. So black women had their own space.
That was such a beautiful house, and it was beautifully furnished, beautifully cared for, and we respected it so much that we just took very good care of it. And there was a Miss Seward who was the housekeeper, and she took excellent care of that house. You'd dare not drop anything and not pick it up.
My earliest memory of going to the Y was to take tap dancing lessons and ballet from Mrs. Kemp. And Mrs. Kemp had someone who played the piano, and she taught us how to dance.
She taught us to do the time step, shuffle one, shuffle two.
And then she would put on these little recitals so everyone's parents could come see them, and you would come out in your little tulle tutus and your ballet shoes. And I don't even know how we remembered all those dances, but you had a tap number, you had a ballet number.
And these 3 or 4 little girls who were about 4 or 5 years old doing this tap dance to rings and things and buttons and bows. And then change a little later on, get in your ballet outfit, and you do something else to another record. I think she got something out of it, and I know the community did. They enjoyed the things too.
And then as we got older, dances started to be given at the Y. So I remember in junior high school, we went to a dance, and I didn't want to go home. And my father came to pick me up, so I hid so he wouldn't see me. And he was furious. So he left me there. I was very mischievous, and my mother had to come pick me up.
The different clubs would have a dance, and there were clubs like by grade in high school mostly, and so you would have probably an annual dance. Of course, your mother was sitting up there looking at you the whole time you were dancing, because, mothers took you to dances.
We not only had a live orchestra of young men, but we only charged like 25 cents, and that was 50 cents for a couple. And in those days, most of the guys didn't bring a girlfriend. They just came, and the girls came. And we charged 5 cents to check coats, and I forget how much the sodas were, probably 3 or 5 cents.
They would play the records, so 45 records, and you dance and have a good time. But it was always a chaperoned event. There were plenty of people around to make sure that nothing happened.
And this is when it got kind of bad with the white kids up at the high school, because the NAACP would give us proms when we graduated from high school, and of course they didn't have proms because they didn't want us to associate with the white children up there. But I was thinking about that this morning. I was thinking that if 2 of those kids, or 4 of them, the white ones, had just said, look, we're good friends, we're coming to the dance, ask the NAACP, if they had asked. I mean, we never refused them. They always refused us. And that would have broken the whole thing down. And it would just, even if 4 of them had shown up. I just thought about that today.
Then, in 1955, was the big day. I got married at St. Paul Baptist Church. And I had my reception at the Girls' Y. It was in the gym. And we took beautiful pictures on the lawn. They had a beautiful lawn and trees. I had 7 bridesmaids and 1 maid of honor. My sister was my maid of honor, and mostly were cousins and friends in my wedding. He had brother-in-law and nephews and brothers in his wedding. And they looked sharp, too.
We raised funds to build a gym. It wasn't very adequate, but it was better than nothing.
We had basketball teams and girls' basketball teams that would compete with other colored Ys.
But I remember the controversy of not having a pool. And I remember that the black children, we couldn't swim at the pool that was down by Applegate Farm on Grove Street. They didn't allow blacks there in Montclair. And so they wanted to build a pool, but I don't think it ever got built.
We would go swimming at the YMCA on a Thursday. That was for the young women. All other time is for the men. Naturally, most of all the young men that went there, they learned how to swim.
And the boys' my dad's swimming pool. So that's where I learned to swim. It was for girls as well as boys.
But the Y was the center for a lot of learning.
Education was always a theme in everything you did. There were plenty of books to read. There were plenty of teachers to teach. There were lots of mentors around. So it was always a theme in everything that went on at the Y, no matter what you did. We even did acting because I had that beautiful stage.
We had quite a bit of exposure to music too, and we could have some tutoring too. Mm-hmm.
There was pottery, there was weaving, you could take painting. They had adult classes, and I know my mother was so proud of some pottery she made and came back showing everybody. And Mrs. Tate got everybody involved. Everyone in the community knew about the Y, and it was central in everyone's lives.
My mother belonged to a couple of clubs in the Y. One I remember was called after that magazine, the Cosmopolitan. I think there was a magazine called and they called themselves the Cosmopolitans. And just about all her girlfriends that she went around with belonged to that.
That's how my mother got involved, through her mother. And that's how I got involved, through my mother. So it was generational. Each generation would bring something to the table and build on the foundation of the previous generation.
That's one generation wanting it better for the next. I loved the mother and daughter banquet. That in that building is a beautiful staircase, and we wore a white skirt and a midi blouse. You got it especially for the mother and daughter banquet. And we would sit, the kids would all sit on those steps. And I think everyone who was active in the YWCA looked forward to that occasion. It was so exciting, and we had a great meal, and there would be a very special person as the speaker at the banquet.
We had parties for the mothers, and we had parties for the fathers. But when we had the fathers would, they had a little talent. And my father would recite the Gettysburg Address, because he was a good poet. And we had a good time, and they laughed and joked. And actually the daughters were all with them, and they helped serve them. And it was really wonderful.
We had clubs, and there would be a president. One of the girls, we would elect a president.
Young women became very confident, demonstrating their ability not only to themselves, but to each other and to their parents. So many women attested to what they learned at the YWCA and how they saw women modeling the kind of womanhood they wanted to achieve in their own lives, no matter where they went. So as a leadership development vehicle for college-trained women who actually worked with the YWCA, as well as young girls and adult women in communities, the YWCA was really a portal to understanding leadership, developing it, and exercising it in ways they often could not do even in their own churches, and certainly not often within the civic government in their own communities.
I really appreciate the fact that Mrs. Tate encouraged all of us to go to college. Aunt Rose went off to Fisk. I went to Morgan.
I went to Hampton. My mother went to Howard. And they are great, great universities.
Some of us went on to Bordentown training school.
You worked. A few went to college, you know, but you worked.
There was always somebody there to get a group together to talk about something, about being a little teenage girl, and to kind of help you bridge that gap in going from a child to a teenager. And I remember being there in my teen years, my early teen years, and always having someone around to talk to about anything.
Doctor would come in and talk, you know, people didn't know how to talk about menstruation. You know, they, even your mother had difficulty back then discussing it, but they would have a doctor come who would tell us all that we needed to know.
I should also add that health clinics and health programs were run out of the YWCA.
Sometimes they'd have visiting speakers, one sort or another.
Langston Hughes came once and spoke. I remember he read his poems, and we were all told what a great poet he was, and to pay attention and to be quiet. And I remember he broke into tears when he read one of his poems, and I don't know what triggered it, but it was very unusual. I remember the adults all saying how unusual it was to see a man cry.
Met Mary McLeod Bethune at the Y. You did? Mary McLeod Bethune.
Oh, really?
Mm-hmm. National Council of Negro Women. Had a luncheon, that was the only place you could go. Where you gonna go? If you were having luncheons, they had luncheons, wedding receptions, everything in the world you wanted to do, you had to do it there. Work or go to the hotels or anything like that. So the National Council of Negro Women had a luncheon. And my mother had this little junior group, myself and my little friends, we would hand out the program for the day and whatnot, and that's when Mary McLeod Bethune came to speak at that luncheon. That's when I met her.
Was she on a cane?
She had a cane, and she wore this big lamb's wool type coat. And she had a cane here, and she told us, "Come over here, daughter. Come over here, daughter." And my mother pushed me, and I went, but I met her.
And then we were involved because they took positive political steps. I don't remember exactly, but I had that kind of a feeling that was the place you went to. We had interesting speakers. Donald Payne was a speaker at the Y. I remember being there. And then our peace group would have meetings like Women's Day, and we bring in poets and dancers, and we would have it at the Y. We had luncheons there where they had political speakers coming. So there was a lot going on.
We saw accomplished blacks, you know, and that's what you need to see. Well, there are a whole lot of us that are being very successful, and of course many more today. Another thing the YWCA had was camp. As I remember, it was either $5 or $7 a week, but we loved camp, and that was a marvelous experience. And you know, it didn't have all the fancy things. We had to walk maybe a mile or two to where we were going to swim and at the first camp, but that was okay.
I didn't learn to swim because I was deathly afraid of the water. And at one point I saw a little tiny water snake go into the water, so that cured me of wanting to get into the water.
I used to have to go for 6 weeks. I hated it, all that. Well, I didn't hate the 6 weeks, but everybody else would write letters, and I'm sure that they weren't having as good a time as they said they were, my girlfriends. But they always made it seem like they were having so much fun, and my mother just made sure that I was up there, and I would go like from the 4th of July, it seemed to me, to Labor Day, but I don't think it was quite that long.
We had great leaders and counselors at the camp, and I remember the first time I went to camp, when I got home, I was still crying that I had to leave camp. I had enjoyed it, that experience so much.
First, my Aunt Rose was a counselor. Then my Aunt Carrie, after the Aunt Rose went off to FIS, she became a counselor. So I was stuck. And then finally, Aunt Dolly, who wasn't worth 2 cents as a counselor, became a counselor. And she was a swimming counselor. Well, that was good because I didn't want to learn to swim. So if I let her borrow my clothes, she would not make me take swimming lessons. So I never did learn to swim. But Aunt Carrie and Aunt Rose, they both insisted that I, you know, do something in the water, and I would. But I didn't like putting my face in the water. But anyway, I went there for years. I think I was from 8 until 16, and I finally rebelled and told the McGee family, who would come to get their daughter Connie, that my mother had said if they would give me a ride, I could come home. And so, you know, people didn't call back and forth and have these iPods and things then, so they believed me and they took me home.
That was a nice experience for me, and it was on Lake Cohasset up in Bear Mountain. So it was close to home, was easy to get to. My dad and mom used to drive me up there and come and get me when it was time to go home.
I attended the day camp when I was real little, before school. I was like 4 years old, and I remember going at 5 years old. I have vivid memories of running around the lawn area in the front of the Y.
And they had little camp activities for us, and you could make jewelry, and you could make pot holders, and they had little arts and crafts for you.
But I remember making a lot of arts and crafts. I remember that very well.
The YWCA was such a welcoming and warm situation. If you didn't like the YWCA, something was wrong with you, because they made life so pleasant in spite of other things that were happening, you know.
My friend and I decided, saw a charm course, it was in '57, at the Y, and we were going to take this charm course with social significance. So we registered, and they called and they said, we want you to know, if you see everybody of this same color and it's not your color, you're still welcome here. So my friend, who was really klutzy, I must say, she and I went, and Lorraine Ewing down the block here now was the teacher, and also Lily Connors. It was soon after my second son was born, and I was a little bit in a depression, I think. And so I said, Lorraine was showing us how to walk, and I had said, I have a baby on my hip every time I want to practice. But Lily cut my hair, and Lorraine showed us how to dress with a little basket, about 2 or 3 things.
So the board became integrated, and they tried to integrate the Y itself. I don't know that it worked so well, because the stigma was that it was still the black Y.
She said, I want to go to the YW. They said, you don't want to go there. That's only for the colored people.
When I served on the board, it was integrated, and it was a good situation. Most of the white women had been on the board for a number of years. And their main contribution to the Y was financial. And of course, they have always been, and this is what my mother used to say, there have always been some good and gracious white people. Of course, there were a lot of them who were helping us because they thought that would put some stars in their crown or something, but they weren't really that sincere.
They asked me to be on the board, but I didn't think it would be entirely appropriate. I come from a Jewish background, and this was a Christian Y. But we're all, looking how to be good, no matter which way we do it.
And then over a period of time, people moved on. Young people didn't come anymore, and I guess the money situation would not suffice to keep the building going, and ultimately it had to change. So
by then, you were free to go, to anything you wanted to. So I guess maybe that affected the popularity of the YWCA.
In 1957 and into 58, the YWCA board did a self-study, and it consisted of a large group of women, including people like Hortense Tate. And what they determined was that the space that was the Israel Crane House was no longer going to be appropriate for the YWCA going forward. And in fact, 2 years later, the town came in and said that it was basically only suitable for gatherings of 6 people or less. So they needed to do something new. So they began to look around and determined that indeed 159 Glenridge Avenue really was the best place for them to be meeting, which meant that they were going to have to build a new building in that space. Now, unfortunately, that meant that the Crane House would have to come down. A group of people got involved from town, and they formed what became the Montclair Historical Society, and they were able to move the house over here to 110 Orange Road.
When they moved it, they dug it up and put it on a conveyor of some sort and moved it. I was attached to the building because I had so many fond memories there. I had no idea what the Montclair Historical Society was all about. I didn't have a clue who they were, what they were going to do. But now I know they wanted to save the Crane House. And they do historical preservation based on what they think needs to be preserved.
And they restored it at that point to reflect its early life, the white founding fathers. And they restored it to be a historic house museum, very typical of the 1965 period, with beautiful colonial furnishings and federal furnishings. And today we look at that, and in a sense, the house is not only an artifact of the Crane family occupation and the YWCA occupation, but it's also an artifact that talks about what historic preservation was like back in 1965 and the choices that they made back then.
And apparently, again, the Y was not an important piece of their preservation projects, so nothing got preserved from the Y. So it was sad to see the building go. It was.
I guess they were going to tear it down if it wasn't for the Historical Society that bought that house and had it transferred to Orange Road. And that's where it's still standing, the old Y and the old Israel Crane house. Yeah, so.
I watched this house, I stood there in the rain and watched this very house move out past the station up Bloomfield Avenue, and it was quite a sight because whoever saw a whole house being moved in Montclair. I walked from there on up to the place where it was put and watched it go on where it is now. And I cried, and I cried, and I cried. Why? Because this was the YWCA, which had meant so much to the African-American people who lived here in Montclair.
Well, I was glad they didn't tear it down, and of course it was quite an event around here, moving it up Bloomfield Avenue. But we were glad that they had moved it so that it would be preserved, and look forward to the new building that was going to be put up. And that was quite a nice move. And then, of course, they tore that one down and put up the one that's there now. But I have had very little activity over there with the new one. I suppose I outgrew it.
The YWCA did indeed build a brand new building down at 159 Glen Ridge Avenue, a beautiful new building. And they stayed there until the early 2000s. And in the early 2000s, they realized that they weren't getting the membership anymore, and so they needed to do something. So they went back to the 1920 charter that they had written long, long ago, that their mothers had written long, long ago. And what it said was that if the YWCA ever ceased to exist as it was, that all the assets would be sold, and the money from those assets would go into the benefit, or in some way benefit, women of color. And so sure enough, they closed the YWCA and they found the Montclair Fund for Women. And to this day, the Montclair Fund for Women still funds programs for minority women.
You can see the YM has gone, the YW has gone, and they were solid rock participants in the Black preservation, if you will. And so it was gone.
My name is Jane Eliasoff. I'm the director here at the Montclair Historical Society, and I want to thank you all for coming. I can't tell you how delighted I am that you're all here. I just think this is one of the neatest projects going. The more I learn about that period, when this house was a Y, but also the part that came before it, when it wasn't in this house, and the part that came after it when it wasn't in this house, it's just remarkable to me. And I really think that in a way this house and your voices are going to be heard now through the beginning of the oral histories that we're doing, and then ultimately when we begin to recreate some of this house so it tells not just the story of early Montclair, but also the story during that period.
No matter what the occasion, all programs started with us singing. Lift every voice and sing. This song was as much a part of our lives as America the Beautiful. We not only learned how to be proper young ladies at our Y, we also learned to be proud of our heritage. It was a place where we could become.